The cold, barren moon of Charax stretched out in endless, rocky plains under a bleak sky. Once a lush landscape teeming with life, it had been devastated by warfare. Now nothing more than a forgotten outpost for alien factions that had moved on. Near a jagged cliffside, a massive wolf beast and her two young cubs huddled together, fighting against the biting winds that swept through the canyons. The wolf, known as a Krelorian direwolf, was a creature bred by the Galactic League for combat. With her sleek, silver fur, towering frame, and violet eyes, she was engineered to be lethal. But the League had deemed her too unruly, and when the conflict on Jarax had ended, they abandoned her and her cubs without a second thought. The mother wolf, whom the Krelorian keepers had once called Shara, let out a low, haunting howl. Her two cubs, shivering and huddled close, whimpered in response. In this hostile environment, survival was nearly impossible for a species so adapted to pack life and teamwork. She couldn't leave her cubs to search for food, and they were too young to hunt themselves. Shara knew that if help didn't come soon, her family wouldn't last much longer. Her howl echoed through the rocky landscape, unanswered and fading into the cold night air. But on the outskirts of Jarax, someone had heard. Sergeant John Avery, a seasoned soldier stationed at an isolated outpost on Jarax, was performing a routine scan of the nearby territories. His mission was to monitor for any life signs, generally stragglers or mechanical leftovers from the abandoned Krelorian fleet. Jarax was his last assignment before returning to Earth, and he was eager for it to be over. Days stretched out in monotonous cycles, with only the sounds of wind and static filling the quiet outpost. That evening, as John reviewed his scanner, something strange appeared on his screen, a faint, pulsing signal indicating life. It was unusual in such a desolate area. Intrigued, he calibrated the scanner, following the source. After a brief trek across the rocky terrain, he approached the area and paused, taking cover behind a nearby boulder as he observed from a distance. In the faint light of Jarax's twin moons he saw them, a massive wolf-like creature, her fur matted and tangled, with two small cubs at her side. John recognized her species immediately, a Krelorian direwolf, a rare and dangerous breed engineered by the League. He'd read reports about the ferocity of these beasts, creatures made for war, known for their strength, intelligence, and powerful bonds. But something was different. This wasn't the fearsome, combative beast he'd imagined. The direwolf was weak, her ribs visible beneath her ragged fur, and her once vibrant violet eyes looked dull and exhausted. Her cubs, barely large enough to stand, huddled against her, their small bodies trembling. John's heart sank as he realized what had happened. The League had abandoned her here. She was nothing more than a casualty of their failed experiment, left to die on this deserted moon. He stepped forward cautiously, making his presence known but keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Shara raised her head, her eyes narrowing as she emitted a low growl, positioning herself protectively in front of her cubs. But her growl was weak, and John could tell she was on the verge of collapse. "Easy there," he murmured, lowering himself to appear less threatening. "I'm not here to hurt you." He reached into his pack and pulled out a canteen of water, setting it down on the ground in front of him before retreating a few paces. The mother wolf eyed him warily, but her instinct for survival won out. She nudged the canteen with her nose, sniffing it cautiously before taking a tentative drink. Her cubs following her lead. John watched them, a mixture of sadness and resolve filling him. These were creatures created for war, yet abandoned without remorse. Despite her ferocity, the mother wolf's protective instincts for her cubs mirrored something deeply familiar to him. She wasn't just a weapon, she was a mother, fighting for her family's survival against impossible odds. As Shara finished drinking, she looked up at him, her violet eyes studying him with a cautious trust. In that moment, John knew he couldn't leave them here to die. His duty might be to monitor this desolate rock, but his heart wouldn't let him walk away. He rose, glancing back toward the direction of his outpost. "Stay here," he whispered, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping she'd sense his intent. "I'll be back." And with that, he headed back, formulating a plan in his mind. He'd bring supplies, food, anything they needed. Against every protocol and order he'd been given, John was determined to save the direwolf and her cubs, no matter the cost. The next morning, John packed his bag with whatever supplies he could scavenge from the outpost. Ration bars, a second canteen, and a few thermal blankets. With each step back to the wolves' den, he steeled himself, hoping the mother wolf, Shara, would remember that he meant no harm. He moved cautiously as he approached the familiar rocky outcrop, making his presence known before she saw him. Shara lifted her head, her violet eyes watching him with a wary intelligence, still half-guarded but no longer hostile. Her two cubs, sensing her change in demeanor, remained curled up by her side, watching John with curiosity. "Easy, girl," he murmured, setting his supplies on the ground and retreating a few paces. He took out a ration bar, unwrapping it, and tossing a piece a few feet away from him. The scent caught the attention of the cubs, who sniffed the air, intrigued. One of them, a little ball of fur with bright, curious eyes, slowly inched toward the food, encouraged by a gentle nudge from its mother. John waited, motionless, as the cub approached. It sniffed the ration bar before taking a tentative bite, and then another, its hunger overcoming its fear. The second cub, seeing its siblings safe, joined in, and soon both were devouring the food with gusto. Shara watched them intently, and when John offered a second piece, she slowly lowered her head, sniffing the offering before accepting it. The powerful beast who had once been bred for war was now reduced to a shadow of her former self, a mother clinging to survival for her cub's sake. John's heart tightened as he watched her eat, his determination to save them solidifying with every glance. Over the next few hours, he stayed nearby, speaking to them in a low, calm tone, sharing bits of his own story, knowing that while they couldn't understand his words, they could sense his intentions. As the day wore on, Shara's tension eased, and she allowed him to sit a bit closer, her gaze steady but no longer hostile. The cubs, sensing the change in their mother, grew bolder, inching closer to John, their eyes filled with curiosity. As the sun set over the desolate landscape, John wrapped a thermal blanket around himself and settled in for the night, refusing to leave their side. Shara curled protectively around her cubs, casting one last glance his way before closing her eyes. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. He was in this for the long haul. Their survival was now his mission. The following morning, John awoke to find the cubs inching even closer, their small noses sniffing at his gear. Shara watched from a few feet away, her body relaxed as she observed his every move. They were starting to trust him, a fragile but growing bond that John was determined to nurture. He slowly extended his hand toward the cubs, his movements careful and steady. The smaller of the two, whom he'd come to think of as Star for her bright eyes, sniffed his fingers before giving them a tentative nudge. Her sibling, whom he'd mentally dubbed Shadow, hung back, but watched with keen interest. Encouraged, John offered another piece of a ration bar, holding it out in his hand. Star took it eagerly, her tiny teeth crunching through the food as she looked up at him with those bright, trusting eyes. Shadow, seeing his sister safe, edged forward and sniffed John's hand before delicately taking a piece for himself. Shara observed, a low rumble of approval vibrating in her throat. John looked up at her, meeting her gaze with quiet respect. "You're not just a beast, are you?" he said softly. "You're a mother, doing everything you can to keep them safe, and I'm going to help you do that." As the days passed, John returned daily, bringing food, water, and supplies. He'd even managed to scavenge a few more thermal blankets to help them through the cold Jarax nights. Each visit deepened the bond between him and the wolf family. Shara allowed him closer to her cubs, her growls becoming softer, almost a greeting rather than a warning. One afternoon, he took a brave step, extending his hand slowly toward Shara herself. She tensed, her eyes narrowing as she considered his gesture. But after a moment's hesitation, she lowered her head and allowed him to place his hand on her thick fur. It was a small, tentative touch, but the warmth of her fur and the steady beat of her breathing connected them in a way that words never could. From that moment on, John knew their bond was real. The once ferocious beast was beginning to trust him, not just as a source of food, but as an ally. Her violet eyes, once cold and wary, softened slightly each time he approached, and she even allowed him to sit beside her as she watched over her cubs. But John knew this fragile peace couldn't last forever. His actions would eventually be noticed by his superiors. and his care for the wolves was a breach of protocol that would not be taken lightly. He was a soldier, bound by rules, and his superiors viewed creatures like Shara as little more than engineered tools, useful only when controlled. Yet every time he looked at the small cubs, playing and tumbling around his feet, and the fierce, devoted gaze of their mother, he knew he could never abandon them. No matter what orders he received, no matter the consequences, he would do everything in his power to protect this family. Days turned into weeks as John continued his daily visits to Shara and her cubs, ensuring they had enough food and water to survive the harsh conditions of Jarax. Each day, his bond with the wolves grew stronger. The cubs had grown bolder, playfully pawing at his boots and nosing his hands for treats, while Shara had taken to lying nearby, her gaze no longer suspicious but almost protective. She was no longer simply tolerating him, she saw him as part of their pack. However, John knew he was walking a tightrope. His superiors were becoming suspicious, noticing the extended patrols he took each day and his depletion of extra rations. While they hadn't yet confronted him, he sensed it was only a matter of time before someone would demand answers. One cold evening, as he sat with Shara and the cubs under the dim light of Jarax's moons, he realized he couldn't simply leave them to fend for themselves. Jarax was a brutal environment, and without him, the wolves wouldn't last. If he was going to keep them safe, he would need a long-term plan. The only solution was relocation. He knew of a sanctuary planet, Lysara, known for accepting abandoned or endangered alien species. It was far, and getting the necessary clearance would be nearly impossible, but it was the only hope for Shara and her cubs. As he formulated his plan, he knew he couldn't do it alone. Later that night, he sent a covert message to Dr. Mara Quinn, an old friend and a xenobiologist dedicated to the preservation of alien species. She had always been an advocate for animal rights, and if anyone would understand the importance of saving Shara and her cubs, it would be her. The next day, a secure reply came through from Dr. Quinn. "John, are you insane?" her message began, laced with worry but ending with, "But you know, I can't resist a challenge. I'll bring the equipment, but this has to be off the record. Command won't turn a blind eye to this." They arranged for her to arrive under the guise of routine medical checks. She landed in a small, unmarked transport ship, keeping her presence discreet. When she met the wolves for the first time, her reaction was immediate awe. "They're magnificent," she whispered, approaching cautiously. "I've read about Krillorian direwolves, but seeing them up close." Shara eyed her warily, but sensing John's comfort around Mara, allowed her to approach the cubs. Shadow and Star, playful as ever, curiously sniffed at Mara's hand, their noses twitching as they took in her scent. Mara's face softened, and she turned to John, her voice a mix of concern and admiration. "You did the right thing, John. They deserve a chance at life beyond this wasteland." With Mara's help, they prepared for the move. She administered a mild sedative to Shara and the cubs to keep them calm during the journey, and they carefully loaded the wolves into a reinforced transport bay, equipped with comfortable bedding, food, and water. Just as they finished, an urgent ping echoed from John's communicator. Command had detected unauthorized transport activity in his sector. "They're on to us," John muttered, his pulse racing. "We need to get out of here now." As they boarded the ship, John took the controls while Mara handled communications, quickly inputting false coordinates to throw off any pursuers. The transport's engines roared to life, and they took off, speeding away from Jarax as quickly as they could manage. But Command was relentless. Within minutes, a patrol ship appeared on their radar, closing in fast. "They're not giving up," Mara said, her voice tense. "They'll catch up to us at this rate." John gritted his teeth, maneuvering the ship toward a dense asteroid belt. "Hold tight, we're going through." Mara's eyes widened. "That's insane." But John was determined. He expertly navigated the ship through the maze of rocks, using the asteroids as cover, forcing the patrol to slow down to avoid collisions. Shara, barely conscious from the sedative, lifted her head and let out a low, comforting growl, as if sensing John's determination. After what felt like an eternity, they finally broke free from the asteroid field, the patrol ship lost behind them. They both exhaled in relief, and Mara managed a shaky laugh. "I'll never doubt your piloting skills again, John." "Neither will I," he replied with a grin, though his heart was still pounding. He glanced back at Shara and the cubs, who were slowly waking from the sedative, their eyes blinking in the dim light. They were safe, for now, but the journey wasn't over yet. As they continued toward Lysara, John looked back at Shara and her cubs, feeling a fierce pride in what they'd accomplished. They were defying the odds together, forging a bond that was as powerful as any he'd ever known. No matter the challenges ahead, John was ready to face them, as long as it meant giving Shara, Shadow, and Star the life they deserved. The journey to Lysara was far from a smooth escape. Command wasn't willing to overlook John's actions, especially not now that he'd taken the Krillorian direwolves into his own care. Within hours of leaving Jarax, Mara's sensors picked up another patrol ship trailing them. The pursuit wasn't over. "We're not going to lose them easily this time," Mara warned, her fingers dancing over the control panel as she assessed their options. John checked the nav data. They were nearing the Orion Nebula, a notoriously dense and disorienting region that could scramble a ship's systems if they weren't careful. But he knew it was their only chance. "We'll go through the nebula," he decided, his voice resolute. "It's risky, but they'll have a hard time tracking us in there." Mara's eyes widened. "John, that's borderline suicidal." He glanced back at the cargo bay where Shara lay beside her cubs, watching him with that steady, fierce gaze that had come to mean trust. He couldn't let them fall back into the hands of those who saw them as expendable weapons. "They trusted me to protect them," he said quietly, meeting Mara's gaze. "I'm not letting them down now." With a determined nod, Mara adjusted their course and the ship shot into the nebula. Vibrant, swirling clouds of gas surrounded them, hues of pink and violet glinting with starbursts of energy. As they entered the thickest part, the ship's sensors went haywire, lights blinking and the system buzzing with interference. Their visibility was nearly gone, and John had to rely on instinct and Mara's careful guidance to navigate. They slowed, moving carefully through the clouds, hoping the patrol would lose their trail. For tense minutes, they drifted in near silence save for the soft hum of the engines. In the cargo bay, Shara lay protectively over her cubs, her ears twitching as if aware of the danger surrounding them. Star whimpered softly, nestling close to her mother, while Shadow kept a cautious watch, his sharp eyes fixed on John as if sensing his determination. Finally, the patrol ship's signal faded from their radar. "We lost them," Mara whispered, relief flooding her voice. John exhaled, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted their course back to Lysara. "Let's keep moving, just in case they pick up our trail again." As they left the nebula, the stars opened up before them, and a calm settled over the ship. They were finally free of their pursuers, at least for now. John leaned back in his seat, feeling the weight of the journey, but also a fierce pride that they were one step closer to freedom. Mara glanced at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "You did it, John. We're almost there." He looked back at Shara, who let out a soft, grateful rumble, her gaze steady and fierce. They were closer than ever to a new beginning. Despite their success in evading the patrol, news of John's actions spread quickly across the galactic channels. As they neared Lysara, he received an official message from the Galactic Union Council. He was to appear for a formal hearing to account for his disobedience and unauthorized actions. The future of Shara and her cubs hung in the balance. Upon arrival on Lysara, John and Mara were escorted to the council chambers, where officials from multiple species awaited them. The story of the direwolves had sparked a heated debate across the galaxy, dividing opinions. Some viewed John as a hero who had saved innocent creatures from abandonment, while others saw him as reckless, endangering lives by bringing a dangerous species into a sanctuary. The council hall was filled with spectators, reporters, and officials. At the front of the chamber, a tall, severe-looking council member with silver eyes and a commanding presence, named Varian, addressed him. "Sergeant Avery," Varian began, his voice echoing across the hall, "you stand accused of disobeying direct orders, compromising mission integrity, and transporting unclassified alien life forms without authorization. What do you have to say for yourself?" John took a deep breath, meeting Varian's gaze with steady conviction. "Shara and her cubs are not just unclassified life forms. They're intelligent, loyal, and capable of trust and connection. The Krellorian League abandoned them to die on Jarax after using them for war. They deserved more than that. They deserved a chance to live. A murmur ran through the audience, and Varian's eyes narrowed. You placed your personal feelings above protocol. How can we trust that these creatures are not a threat to others? Mara stepped forward, her voice calm but impassioned. I'm a xenobiologist with extensive experience in alien species preservation, and I can attest to the Krellorian direwolves' capacity for social bonding and loyalty. They were only dangerous because they were treated as weapons. John saw their potential for more. Another council member, an elder from the empathetic Ryan species, raised her hand to speak. Sergeant Avery, you claim they are capable of trust. How did you come to this conclusion? John recounted his days with the wolves on Jarax, describing Shara's protectiveness over her cubs, their gradual trust in him, and the moments they allowed him to be part of their family. Shara is a mother first and foremost. She cares for her cubs with the same dedication any of us would for our families. She trusted me because I showed her kindness and respect. She protected me as much as I protected her. The Rian elder nodded thoughtfully while the council exchanged glances, clearly moved by his words. But Varian remained stoic. While your account is compelling, this council must prioritize safety above sentimentality. Sentient or not, these creatures are unlike any known in the galaxy. The risk they pose cannot be overlooked. At that moment, a voice rang out from the audience, a young xenobiologist who had followed the case closely. Counselors, if we deny these creatures a chance at freedom, we're denying the galaxy a chance to expand its understanding of sentient life. They deserve to be seen for who they are, not judged solely on their origins. Applause rippled through the crowd, and others echoed the sentiment, calling for the council to reconsider. After a long pause, Varian raised his hand for silence. The council will deliberate. John and Mara waited in tense silence as the council members discussed behind closed doors. When they finally returned, Varian addressed the chamber. After careful consideration, we have reached a decision. Sergeant John Avery, you will not face disciplinary action. Furthermore, Shara and her cubs will be granted asylum on Lysara under the oversight of the Galactic Preservation Society. This arrangement will be reviewed annually, with the hope that it sets a precedent for how we treat sentient beings, regardless of their origin. The chamber erupted in cheers, and John felt an overwhelming wave of relief and gratitude. Shara, Shadow, and Star were free, and their story had sparked a movement toward compassion across the galaxy. As he and Mara left the council chamber, a crowd gathered to thank them, and John realized that his actions had inspired a change far greater than he'd ever imagined. The wolves he had saved weren't just survivors, they were symbols of a new era, one in which even the most dangerous creatures had a chance to live in peace. With the council's decision in place, Shara and her cubs were granted official asylum on Lysara, where vast natural sanctuaries offered them the space and freedom to live as they pleased. John accompanied them to their new home, guiding them through the open grasslands, forests, and gentle rivers that stretched across the sanctuary planet. Shara's eyes sparkled with a mix of curiosity and cautious excitement as she explored her new territory, her cubs bounding around her with playful energy. John watched as Shadow and Star, now more confident than ever, wrestled and chased each other through the tall grass. For the first time since he had found them, they were no longer fighting for survival. They were simply living. Shara, once a fierce protector against all threats, began to relax, her sharp gaze softening as she took in the gentle, unthreatening surroundings of Lysara. Dr. Maraquin stayed on Lysara to help John adjust the wolves to their new environment. She had prepared a space within the sanctuary where visitors could observe Shara and her cubs from a respectful distance, hoping their story would inspire a new appreciation for the complexities of alien life. One evening, as the sun set in twin streaks of red and gold, John sat with Mara on a hill overlooking the sanctuary. They watched Shara nudge her cubs playfully, showing them how to hunt in the safer, prey-filled terrain. The wolves were thriving, and John's heart swelled with pride. You know, I never imagined things would turn out like this, John said, a trace of wonder in his voice. When I found them on Jarax, all I wanted was to give them a fighting chance. I never expected to be part of something so big. Mara nodded, her gaze warm. What you did, John, wasn't just about saving Shara and her cubs. You changed how the galaxy sees them and creatures like them. You gave the Council a reason to reconsider their own biases. They fell into a comfortable silence, watching as Shadow and Star curled up beside their mother, drifting off to sleep under the vast, star-filled sky. John felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had come to Jarax as a soldier, trained to follow orders, but he was leaving Lysara as something much more. A guardian and an advocate for beings once deemed unworthy of compassion. The story of Shara, Shadow, and Star spread across the galaxy, and they quickly became symbols of resilience, loyalty, and the importance of second chances. Beings from countless species visited Lysara, drawn by the story of the human soldier who had defied protocol to protect a family of alien wolves. People from all walks of life gathered at the sanctuary, learning not only about the Krellorian direwolves, but also about compassion and coexistence. John and Mara became co-founders of a new organization, the Galactic Guardians Initiative, dedicated to advocating for the rights of alien creatures and preserving endangered species across the galaxy. They were invited to intergalactic summits, conferences, and schools, where they shared the story of Shara and her cubs, inspiring others to consider the value of all life, regardless of its origins. On Lysara, the sanctuary expanded, opening more habitats for abandoned and endangered creatures. Visitors marveled at Shara's regal presence, Shadow's cautious curiosity, and Star's playful antics. The wolves were no longer seen as fearsome weapons. They were beings with emotions, intelligence, and a capacity for connection. People left the sanctuary with a new understanding of the importance of empathy and a commitment to fighting against the abandonment of sentient creatures. One day, a young boy visiting from a neighboring star system approached John, his eyes wide with excitement. "Is it true, Sergeant Avery?" he asked. "Did you really save them all by yourself?" John smiled, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "I didn't save them alone. They saved me too. They taught me that bravery isn't just about fighting, it's about standing up for those who can't protect themselves. And they showed me that sometimes family is more than just who you're born with. It's who you fight for." The boy beamed, looking over at Shara and her cubs, who were lounging peacefully in the grass, their bond as strong as ever. That evening, as the stars glittered over the sanctuary, John and Mara took one last stroll through the sanctuary grounds. They watched as Shara lifted her head, her eyes reflecting the starlight, and let out a long, proud howl, a sound of freedom and strength that echoed across the land. Shadow and Star joined in, their voices blending with their mother's in a harmonious call. Mara leaned closer to John, her voice soft. "You did something remarkable, John. You showed the galaxy what it means to be truly courageous." John smiled, his gaze on Shara and her cubs. "We all have a duty to protect what's vulnerable, to stand by those who need it. I may have started this journey for Shara, but now, I'm here for every creature like her." As they walked back toward the sanctuary's entrance, John felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The wolves he had saved had given him a reason to fight for more than just himself, to work toward a future where every life, regardless of how dangerous or different, could be seen as worthy. Together, John, Mara, Shara, Shadow, and Star had forged a legacy, one that would inspire generations to come. They were no longer just a soldier, a scientist, and a family of alien wolves. They were guardians of the forgotten, champions of compassion, and pioneers of a future where empathy reached beyond the stars.